España es aire, aire y sol. 1, 2, 3, 30, 300 días de sol al año. Y campos y mares. Y un ancho océano. España es tierra de molinos que doman el viento. Desde siempre, nación de viento, sol, de tierra ancha y aguas profundas. Un país de energía inagotable que apuesta por desplegar sus recursos naturales para acelerar la transición ecológica y crecer de forma sostenible y descarbonizada gracias a ese potencial privilegiado. Somos el 8º país con mayor potencia renovable instalada y el 2º en Europa. Casi la mitad de la generación eléctrica nacional ya es renovable. Un sector con más de 111.000 empleos que se triplicarán en esta década. Y ya somos el 10º mercado más atractivo en el mundo para inversiones en energía verde. En el nuevo modelo energético que destierra los combustibles fósiles, el ciudadano se erige en actor principal. En España el autoconsumo se ha multiplicado por 10 desde 2017 y el mapa de las comunidades energéticas crece cada día. España ha situado el clima y la energía en el centro de una transformación integral para lograr la neutralidad climática en 2050. Una economía de bajas emisiones competitiva y eficiente que asegure la soberanía energética con recursos limpios y propios y garantice la protección de los hogares. Esta transición debe ser justa con las personas y los territorios. La premisa es no dejar a nadie atrás, creando alternativas innovadoras, manteniendo el empleo y la población con inversiones ligadas a la economía verde, con diálogo y participación ciudadana. En este camino a la descarbonización, SPIREC 23 arranca como foro para crear sinergias y sumar voces de alto nivel al debate de cómo encajar las piezas en el diseño del futuro energético, para ahondar juntos en este reto común con un diálogo constructivo y pleno de aciertos. El mundo nos está mirando.
Damos paso a la última mesa redonda de alto nivel de esta conferencia internacional. Invitamos ahora a subir a este escenario a la consejera de la Comisión Nacional de Mercado de Valores, Elena Viñes, consejero delegado del Clean Energy Council, Ken Thornton, consejero delegado del New Energy Nexus, Danny Kennedy. Modera esta mesa la subdirectora general de Prospectiva, Estrategia y Normativa en materia de energía en el Ministerio para la Transición Ecológica y el Reto Demográfico, Miriam Bueno.
Okay. Hello and good afternoon to everyone. I am delighted to welcome you all to the closing ceremony of the SPIREC conference that is entitled Continuous Acceleration to be 2050 Ready. Today we have an incredible panel with us. After discussing the energy transition over the past few days, we now need to focus on how we can accelerate and be prepared for the big challenge ahead, achieving climate neutrality by 2050 for the entire planet. For this, we need to coordinate and plan the next steps to be taken in both the short and long term. Our panelists bring a wealth of expertise and experience to the table. Elena Viñes, who has been recently appointed as president of the Platform on Sustainable Financing of Europe, is a policy advisor and sustainability analyst with an impressive career spanning across the European Union, the United Nations and Spain. Ken Thornton, from the Clean Energy Council in Australia, works with different companies that support the clean energy sector in Australia and is committed to providing networking opportunities and expertise to the industry. And finally, last but not least, Danny Kennedy represents the New Energy Nexus, an amazing initiative which supports energy entrepreneurs from emerging techs to clean energy deployment and adoption. Today, I would like to draw your attention to 3 crucial elements that have the potential to transform our society and pave the way for a better future: investment, social innovation, and technology development. Our discussion will focus on the challenge of having a clear pathway for investment in the next decade, which should be allocated to the entire energy and economic system transformation. We need to increase and scale up the renewable energies together with flexibility installation such as demand response and energy storage. We also need to take into account the participation and needs of different communities around the world. Without the involvement of citizens, the energy transition will not be successful. Lastly, we need to focus on new technologies that are going to bridge the gap of reducing emissions in the green transition. According to the International Energy Agency Energy Technology Perspective Report, this new technology will be essential to reduce emissions in the future. Developing this technology will require the cooperation with the research and development sector. These three axes, investment, social innovation, and technology development, are fundamental to achieving progress. But we must not forget about the critical role that conservation of our natural resources and environment plays. It is crucial that we consider the environmental impact of our actions and ensure that we are making sustainable choices. In conclusion, we have a significant challenge ahead in the pathway to pledge net zero. All efforts, decarbonizing technologies, international agreements, and forms of cooperation will be necessary to sum up efforts or to subtract emissions up to 2050. I hope this discussion will be an opportunity for us to share ideas and contribute to this task. So first of all, I will start with the first panelist, Elena Viñes. As I have said, she is a specialist in sustainable financing. So I would like to start by asking, what do you think that are the essential aspects to consider an investment sustainable, given your role as an advisor in the development of the regulation of taxonomy in Europe? Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam, and good afternoon to everyone. Until very recently, we were living in a situation that was, let's call it an anomaly, because corporates and financial institutions alike not only were defining what was green, but also how green they were. And we were talking about, for example, a market of green bonds of over $1 trillion. But were we sure about that figure? Were we actually adding apples to carrots? And that's exactly. That situation has somehow come to an end with the development of the taxonomy. What is the taxonomy? The taxonomy actually, or it responds to a need to speak a same language, to have a common language, at least within Europe. I understand that there are almost 30 jurisdictions that also have developed or are in the process of developing their own taxonomies, like in Australia. And basically, what we mean by taxonomy, which is a Greek word that is the response to a scientific classification, is, as I said, that language. I see the taxonomy as a dictionary that includes basically all the economic activities that can be considered sustainable and under which circumstances. But let me explain to you what are the key features of the taxonomy. The taxonomy is based in two building blocks. On one hand, for an economic activity to be considered sustainable, or an investment needs to contribute substantially to one of the 6 environmental objectives without harming any of the other environmental objectives or without undermining minimum international social standards. What are those 6 environmental objectives? The 6 environmental objectives are climate mitigation, climate adaptation, water and marine resources, biodiversity, pollution, ecosystems, and that I already said, and circular economy. So that said, how do we measure that substantial contribution to one of them and that do no significant harm to any of the other? Those are translated into what we call technical criteria, where wherever possible has to be quantitative. How we measure substantial contribution is through the contribution of that economic activity to the achievement of a European objective. For example, for mitigation, what we looked at is at 2050 we need to be carbon neutral. By 2030 we need to reduce emissions at least by 55%. Now, the concept of do no significant harm is extraordinarily important. First, because as many of us know, we cannot really separate the different environmental objectives. There are huge interlinks between them. We cannot reach carbon neutrality without fighting, without putting an end to deforestation, for example. And those trade-offs have been neglected traditionally, particularly within the financial system. And that concept of do no significant harm, shall I say, that principle is one of the core principles that you will find all across the sustainable finance package within the EU that actually has gone beyond private finance and is essential for public finance. For example, we see the do no significant harm principle being a core principle of the Recovery and Resilience Facility.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elena. Now we are moving to a question for both Kane and Danny. And we are involved in this acceleration of the transformation of the energy system, this energy transition. So I have two sides question for you. How do we ensure that this acceleration of this energy transition is socially equitable and can be understood by society as a whole? And also, if you want to ask, to reply also to the second question that is related to the first one, how can we link ecosystems with this in this aspect? So thank you.
I guess to answer the first, it's not just how could we or should we try to make this socially just. I think we have to. The only thing that will stop us now as a renewable energy industry is politics, geopolitics and local politics, and the social license to do the massive build-out that we've been talking here. As much solar will be installed in the next 5 years, according to our forecasts, as has been installed in the history to date. That could grind to a halt if that solar is done over the wishes of communities and without considering its impacts and so forth. So we have to make this socially just. How do we do that? It's all the process work and the rightful thinking and planning that has been mentioned. And, I think there is great prospect that we can actually do energy differently. The way the history of fossil fuels obviously worked was at the expense of people and the planet, and the great potential and promise of renewables has always been we could have local organic sunshine falling fresh from the sky every morning, and wind and waves and other technologies just delivering what we need as a society for electricity and mobility services and everything else. But we really have to focus on engaging the community. So to go to the second part of your question, I think the stakeholders that have historically come to things like IREC since 2004 need to broaden and need to break down the barriers between them. We need not just policymakers in engineering and financial engineering and the electrical wonks that we all are. We need to talk to sociologists and indigenous activists, and because the land base that will be where the critical minerals and much of the work will be done is in many cases and countries on indigenous land. We have to respect them and go through the rightful first prior informed consent processes to get the work done. And then most importantly, I think we've talked a bit about this week, there's just not enough attention to the global south, whether it's in the loss and damage context or whether it's just in the future energy demand of the world is coming up in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, in Africa, and ridiculously small volumes of our efforts, our mind share, our media, our conversations, and our money is flowing into those places. And so we how do we do socially just? We redress the colonialism and historical injustice that was inherent in the energy system of the 20th century with something much better in the 21st century.
If I can just add to that, I think it's very clear that the global community want to see this acceleration towards a renewable energy future, but it comes with a caveat that it must be done well. And if I reflect on the Australian experience, we've doubled the amount of renewable energy in Australia in just the last 5 years. And I think what that's done is given us some learnings and some examples of how to work very positively with the community. I think we've seen examples of where we've made mistakes, we haven't taken the community with us, or the way in which projects have been delivered haven't been respectful to the communities in the right way. And so that gives us some learning. What we know in Australia, and indeed around the world, is we now need to accelerate. In Australia, we need to double the pace at which we're deploying renewable energy, and that's going to mean we're going to need to pay a lot of attention to the sort of things that Danny spoke about in Australia. That includes First Nations people, how we support them, how we engage them, how they participate in the workforce, how First Nations business become parts of these exciting clean energy projects. And of course, what we also see is the community themselves as homeowners and business owners. They actually want to be investors in the clean energy transition. In Australia, again, I think we pretty well lead the world as far as the percentage of households with rooftop solar. About 3 million homes out of about 10 or 11 million homes have rooftop solar. And I think this is a demonstration of the enthusiasm of the community to be part of this energy transition. But in doing that well, we need to have safety and standards for how systems are installed and how they're maintained. We need really sensible and modern regulation about how we price the power that they produce and how it's sent back into the grid, about how the distribution businesses might be able to access and control those systems so they maximise the contribution to the electricity grid. And I think these are all examples of where we need to be very deliberate. We need to accelerate the sort of reform and the sort of planning and behaviour of industry and regulators and policymakers, so that ultimately that strong public support that is there continues long into the future.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Very interesting experience. I think that we can come back later with this kind of lesson learned. So I will come back to the finance part with Elena. So you were involved in the development of one of the very interesting reports of the United Nations high-level expert group. This is the report Integrity Matters in Business and Finance. As one of the authors of this report, can you share some recommendations that you believe that are crucial in achieving the net zero by 2050? Thank you.
Yes, of course. Over the last few years, we've seen a plethora of net zero pledges made by corporates, financial institutions, cities and regions, which is really commendable, and it's a great first step. However, the UN Secretary General was concerned because of mounting criticism that was surrounding those pledges, and at the same time for the fact that those pledges were not turning into real action. So he created a group and told us, look, what you need to do is to develop a set of criteria, like a criteria checklist that will help us to distinguish greenwashers from those who are actually committers, that actually like a minimum standards or minimum criteria that all pledges ought to have in order for those pledges to turn into action. And that's what we did, and we came up with 10 recommendations, but I'm going to give you just a nutshell, concentrating on 3 of them. The first one is that all pledges ought to be in line with the IPCC's greenhouse gas emissions, net zero emissions model pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees with no or limited overshoot. It is all very good that companies and financial institutions do exercises like scenario analysis for prudential requirements and in order to manage the risks. But when it comes to the pledges and transition plans, we need to stick to the global goal and to what science says. The second recommendation that I would like to highlight is the importance of medium and short-term targets. You would be surprised how few of them actually have set interim targets. So they all have said this, 2050 I will become net zero, or by 2060. And the intermediate what I call the interim targets and short-term targets are important, not only because they are essential in order to follow the pathways that I was talking about that tell us that emissions have to peak by 2025 and that we have to have global emissions by 2030, but also because we need to commit the top management, we need to engage top management on the boards of those companies today. They need to feel ownership, they need to commit, they need to think about those targets and reducing emissions today when they plan their business plans, when they enter, mergers and acquisitions, when decided where to invest their capital, and so forth. And there's no better way for actually, engaging top management that on one hand setting up those short-term targets, but at the same time making them responsible and linking their remuneration packages to the achievement of those targets. Now, number 3, once you have set out your pledges, so you know where you want to get, then tell us how you plan to do it, by when and how. It is extraordinarily important that companies and financial institutions develop very detailed transition plans, and that then they report annually on the progress made. And both the transition plans and the progress report ought to be verified by independent third party. So it's essential that they are detailed, that they are verified, but also they are aligned. And what do I mean by aligned? Aligned with the business strategy, aligned with the public policy and lobbying activities, aligned with how they invest their R&D, their capital investments, their governance that I mentioned before, the remuneration packages, and so forth. Now, 2 last observations. The first one is that when we talk about pledges, targets, transition plans, what we're talking about is absolute emissions and all emissions throughout the value chain. That is scope 1, 2, and 3. And that includes, for the financial sector, which is the core of their emissions, the credit portfolios and their investment portfolios. The other observation I want to make is that, yes, our task was to develop criteria to make pledges, credible. But you would be surprised if I tell you that only 1/3 of the top world's traded public companies have committed to net zero. This means that there are 2/3 of the world's traded companies, largest companies in the world that are out, plus all the state-owned and private-owned companies that the majority of them haven't. So the question I have for you is that, do you really think realistically that we have enough time on one hand to convince all those companies and financial institutions, and at the same time for all of them to apply the criteria that we set up? The answer is no, and this is why our last recommendation is that it's about time that governments and countries step up and they start regulating net zero.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Once we have this top-level view of which is the way to achieve this carbon neutrality, I would like to ask you a question to both Danny and Kane about, as you are in the ground and you have an extensive experience in implementing a project, I would like to know if you could please share with us some valuable lessons learned from the project that you have implemented in your organizations. Thanks.
Yeah, so maybe if I can touch on a number of the lessons. I think the first one is about the importance of policy. It's obviously been a big theme of the discussions here over the past 3 days, and we know the challenges. We know the challenges for investors and for industry. If the policy isn't strong, it's not stable, and it's not investable. And I think that's clearly very critical. I think, my observation is that the world is moving very rapidly at the moment, and I think what we've seen from the United States through the Inflation Reduction Act is very much a new paradigm, particularly linking climate and industrial policy, I think, in ways that we haven't seen before. And, I think the rest of the world, I think, clearly is now responding in various ways, and I think that's going to really, in a way, it's created, if you like, a global clean energy arms race, which I think for the world is a great thing, for the industry is a great thing, but it does change the dynamics globally. I think one of the areas most significantly, I think it puts some pressure on is in terms of the supply chain, and certainly in Australia we see this dynamic where we have a fairly limited local manufacturing base and supply chain for clean energy, and I think what we're now seeing is a real focus on partnership between industry, between researchers, between manufacturers, between governments, and governments both national and interregional, to really look at how can we be much more strategic about the supply chain, because access to low cost, reliable equipment is going to be absolutely critical if we're going to achieve the sort of targets that we're going to need to over the coming decades.
Thanks. I don't know, Danny, if you would like to add in your experience to this?
Just a couple of quick stories, because I like to tell stories of entrepreneurs making it happen. Our theory at New Energy Nexus is that all of this is great, and then there's people out there in the world making the businesses that make the magic happen. And maybe the lessons of these two stories are sort of, we should look for the next phase of this massive acceleration in unusual places, and we should try to leverage some existing infrastructure and assets to get there, and I'll tell you why. So the first one is just a story to the previous question as well, about how we make this just and equitable and redress some of the historical injustices, like the travesty of treatment of many countries in the global south and the need to deal with that. We have that in America with Indigenous Americans, and in the last 5 years we've helped set up a company on Navajo Reservation. Navajo is a nation, a sovereign nation of 250,000 Americans. It's a land base the size of West Virginia, and some 15,000 families don't even have electricity in this place. This is Arizona state in the middle of southwestern America, and its main business was coal mining and coal-fired power. 4 big power plants, most of which have shut down now, and they all sold power out to Los Angeles, Vegas, Phoenix, these large American cities. And these transmission lines would run over the heads of these houses that didn't even have electricity or running water. And this Navajo entrepreneur came to us and said, we want to build a business, and what we want to do is leverage these transmission lines, because they've been stranded. They're sunk costs sitting there, wasted because the coal's shut down, but they go to market, and we've got plenty of sunshine up here on the high desert, and we're going to build a solar development company. And they needed some support to get that going, and impact investors and things that we were able to organize. But it's just sort of this story about we can achieve social outcomes and equity and justice intergenerationally and generationally, and the climate solutions and spread of solar if we look for these, leveraging these assets as these guys did. And then similar but different in the Philippines, we've got an amazing entrepreneur in the last 5 years. He's 29 years old now, so when he was 21 he started his company. He's on the cusp of building 10 gigawatts of power for Manila, because when he went into the reverse auctions and the bids for the RFPs to provision the mid-merit power and the supply to this 30 million person city in the middle of Southeast Asia, his was the cheapest price. Solar plus storage is cheaper than coal coming from Indonesia or Australia. It's cheaper than gas that the Filipinos are wanting to import. And so he won the bids. And now he's 29 years old, and he's trying to build, 3.5 gigawatts of solar and storage here and 700 megawatts there, and this crazy build out that you can read about if you're interested. But the real lesson for me is that we need to work out how to finance breakout stories like that. That is going to repeat in Indonesia, in Myanmar, in Ethiopia, in Congo, in all kinds of countries, and we need to provide capital. This kid's happened to work the local oligarchs and financial institutions, but that's not always going to be the way. And so we've got to find better ways to bring capital flows to the global south, which we've spent a lot of time talking about today. And Irina published an amazing report with Climate Policy Institute, if you haven't seen it, documenting the need for this. But much work to be done, but lots of inspiring lessons about how to do it from the startups and entrepreneurs out there in the world.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. We only remain three minutes left, so I don't know if you want to add anything else in the future for the energy transition in your experience. Something to add, very, very short. Maybe Elena?
What can I add in 3 minutes? Maybe one of the the questions that you asked me when we discussed the panel, which was, what are, from your perspective, some of the key challenges that we're facing? And I think that from my own experience, when we work on developing the European taxonomy, in particular the climate mitigation, our starting point was that 250, carbon neutral Europe, and we work backwards, and we examined the different economic activities, today's economic activities, and we found that there are three key types of economic activities. Those that are already low carbon or close to low carbon, such as renewables, those who enable the majority of economic activities to transition. We're talking about mainly the technologies that they are in the value chain, for example, the turbines for wind energy. And then there are the transitional activities. And the transitional activities from a taxonomy perspective are those activities who are absolutely necessary for the economy to function, for which there's no substitute, such as cement or steel, and yet they're far from net zero. And on those, when we established the substantial contribution that was mentioned before, it was based on the best in class. Those activities deserve a lot of attention because those activities require massive investments that the majority of the cases cannot be done by one corporate. They need to be done by the entire industry with the help of policymakers on incentives, but many times it's not only about the incentives and the support, it's also that we need to make changes in other regulatory domains in order to help them to make the investments, for example, in competition law, right? If they need to really collaborate, then we need to review our antitrust policies, for example. Those activities deserve a lot of attention. The other type of activities that deserve a lot of attention are those who have no technological or economic viable solution, and they do have a lower carbon replacement, such as coal power generation. For those activities today, we're basically saying to financial institutions and corporate, just get rid of them, And it's like a parcel that we keep passing, but the parcel is kicking, And that one day it will explode. I think we need to start, stopping blaming and shaming and help those companies and financial institutions to actually get rid of them, To decommissioning, to shutting them down, and I think that also deserves a lot of attention.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are run out of time. Maybe you would like to add something at the end, but very short.
If I can just make a very brief reflection, it's been, I think, an incredibly inspiring 3 days, and I think listening to the stories of progress and the great, the great pace of change that we're now seeing for renewable energy, clearly here in Spain, Europe, and now right around the world. I think that should give us all an incredible amount of hope for the future, albeit we now know we need to accelerate even further, and I think that now turns our attention to the how do we transition, how do we manage investment, how do we support the community, how do we bring the technology in, how do we do this at pace. And I guess to note, my attention now moves to the next IREC, and I guess it's an open invitation for all of you to join us in Australia, in South Australia, in Adelaide in April 2024, where many of these topics will be a big focus, sharing the lessons both from South Australia and Australia, but also around the world, because we need to collaborate and we need to share those lessons so we can move faster.
So thank you very much. This is the best closing possible. Thank you for giving us the hand to visit Australia for the next time. Thank you all the presents for joining us in this important discussion. We move to the last part of the closing ceremony. Thank you very much.
A continuación, los organizadores de esta conferencia harán un balance de estos días en los que se ha analizado y debatido sobre cómo acelerar la transición energética. Suben al escenario la directora ejecutiva de REN 21, Rana Adib, y el director general de IDAE, Joan Groizard.
Muy buenas tardes. Very good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for participating in this final session for IDAE, for SPIREC 2023. As you know, we have Rana Adib and myself as co-hosts, RUN21, and IDAE is part of the Spanish government in the organization of SPIREC 2023.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Johan. And I guess, from my side, the first part is to be very excited to be here with you at the end of SPIREC. Not because it's the end, but just because we also know what was happening all behind. And from RUN21 side, the first part is very clearly to thank the Spanish government and IDAE for co-hosting basically this conference. So. But I guess we thought it would be really nice to do this a bit more informally and find out what we thought about those days. It was for you the first International Renewable Energy Conference, John. So what were your impressions?
No, indeed. So this was the first time that Spain hosted an IREC, hosted one of these international renewable energy conferences. And I think as one of the personal outcomes, that as a renewable energy community, if that's what we can all collectively call ourselves, I think we should be quite proud. We should be quite proud of in just 3 days, we have been able to touch upon the main issues, the main debates surrounding the current status of renewable energy. I think we all knew decades ago already that the renewable energy is the solution to the climate crisis, but it's become a lot more obvious in the last few years that it's the solution also to a lot of the social, economic crises we are facing, whether that's cost of living crisis, security of supply, access to energy, healthcare. So, and I think all of those complexities and diverse debates have been really picking up throughout SPIREC. So very, very proud of what we've done. But indeed, you have been participating and indeed co-organizing all of these IRECs since the origin. So I'm really keen to understand and to know, how the debate has been moving on in the last few years, how this IREC compares to previous editions of the conference.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, indeed, that's where I feel like getting really old when I think about the number of IRECs I've been participating in. But the reality is, and I think that's also something which is really important. When you look back, basically, you also see that change is happening, and change is happening continuously. And that is something which I felt was really interesting here. The maturity of the discussions is amazing. We don't speak about energy as energy only anymore, but very clearly this energy as enabler, renewable energy as an enabler, as a possibility to redistribute power, economic power. I think really the program, but also what we have encountered here very much in Spain, is very much reflective of this, that there is an economic and industrial component dimension that is fundamental to the energy transition, but also the societal one. So this is one part, but the complexity also means, so it's maturity, it means complexity, and I think that's probably the questions I have and some of the takeaways on the IREC is how do we also evolve this and bring basically the great energy discussions we have here even in another way into the ecosystem. So you spoke about health, there's education, we had sessions on agriculture, transport. So, and I think that's probably the part. There's paradigm shifts that go beyond energy. So the economic system, we spoke about disruptions in supply chains from globalization to deglobalization. And here I would say what is really interesting is that the disruption are also felt in the IREC process of the last years. So.
Definitely. And I think you were talking about the maturity of the debate. That's something that when we are discussing the organization of SPIREC in Spain, and we were trying to analyze together what is the current status of the renewable energy debate in Spain, and indeed from the Spanish perspective, definitely, we understand that Spanish society, Spanish businesses, Spanish administration is indeed at this very mature point of the debate. I think for decades, Spain has been very active in renewable energy, but the real movement we have seen, I think, is in the last 4 years. Something that we also shared. Only a few years ago, we created for the first time in Spain ever a ministry for the ecological transition, a ministry, a portfolio which brings together under one mandate climate change and energy. But it's a philosophy, I guess, that permeates other parts of the Spanish government, for example, and we are very privileged to have with us the minister responsible for this topic today. The Ministry for Public Works, for Public Infrastructure, is now a ministry for transport, mobility, and the urban agenda. So the idea that government, not only from the environmental mandate, but throughout government, throughout all of the public administrations, we understand that this transition of society, of the economy, is something key to all of the aspects. indeed, it's something that we share from the government, but as I was saying earlier, corporations, civil society, NGOs, workers' unions are all, I believe, in the Spanish context, really participating in this debate. And as I hope you have seen, it is no longer about the if or the when. I think everyone is clear that the energy transition must happen and is happening, and it must happen now. The debate is about the how and how to do it properly. And I think, at least for us, we have been able to, one, acknowledge that, and sometimes my Spaniard colleagues will agree, sometimes we need the external view to recognize that, okay, sometimes we are at the very top of a lot of rankings. And I think when we talk about renewable energy in Spain, we really have to be proud internally and externally of what we have achieved and what we have in front of us. So I think that's a very positive outcome for us in this conference, but also obviously looking at best practices internationally. So again, I think corporations, public sector, and civil society have been able to learn a lot about how to accelerate this today. But something that I'm keen to hear is, okay, I've tried to explain what the situation is from the Spanish perspective. How is the Spanish debate and the Spanish situation useful, hopefully, for the debate internationally?
I think this is really something we have encountered, I think, in the preparation of the conference, also together with the International Advisory Committee, for instance, in the discussions when we met with stakeholders, but also all the great examples that we have heard here and the political vision is something which really showed that it is a stronger integration, and I guess the structuring of the ministry is probably also reflective of this, that we need to have stronger integration between the sectors, that it's a multidimensional question that also requires having the different stakeholders around the table, but also bridging. We saw a lot of bridging between urban and rural areas. The question of how do we build basically ecosystem, because it is renewable energy for people, but it's also renewable energy with people, and I think that is really something which we could experience very much, and where I think there's a lot of learning out of it. The other part, I think, is really fully acknowledging that there is an economic opportunity for the countries, building up industries for the national domestic market in a regional context, but also for export. And I think that's probably one of the learnings which I found really interesting. The reality here is a bit different than in many countries. And as such, basically this acknowledgement of the fact that the starting point, the economic patterns of a country, the industrial realities are different, also mean that we can basically learn from each other, but that not every single country will basically go down this pathway, but that the regional integration is fundamental, the sectoral integration is fundamental, and bridging the ecosystem. And I think even on the panel before we heard it, like how do we bring the entrepreneurs who are doing it to the table, to the debates? And so I feel like also with Genera happening in parallel, there were lots of inspiring technological solutions, and yeah, that's certainly something which is really important. With regard to this, I really think that it is one of the takeaways again is, it is, as you said, like not the what, but how we do it. And here I feel that there is probably solutions that are being implemented here already on how to basically bring the different stakeholders together in ecosystem to rather build not the energy transition and accelerate it because we want to accelerate the energy transition, but to really create jobs, to create the economic opportunities. And probably another takeaway for me is maybe we need to ask some questions differently in the future and rather put basically renewables at the heart, but by putting the benefits of renewables into the forefront of the discussion. I guess like to close, Joan, what are your key takeaways and highlights from SPIREC, and what would you also like to pass on to Australia that is going to host the next IREC?
So I fully agree with the last messages you were sharing, Rana. I think a lot of what we've discovered is asking the question differently and asking the question to the right people. As you can see, the tagline for SPIREC is renewables for people, and I'd like to paraphrase Maria Neira from the World Health Organization, who participated in the opening ceremony, who sort of tweaked the tagline to renewables for healthy people. And I think that's very, very important, and it might summarize a lot of what we're trying to do. Climate change is, amongst other things, a health crisis as well. A lot of the solutions to climate change, a lot of the implementation of renewable energy, healthier transport, healthier buildings, all revolve around health. And when we talk about jobs, when we talk about industry, we're also talking about decent living conditions. Having the right means, having access to clean energy, having access to clean cooking, for example, very critical in some countries. So at the end of the day, when we talk about having a clean and carbon neutral energy system, when we talk about having a clean economy, at the end of the day, it's about quality of life, it's about healthcare, it's about what it means for us as a society. So I think that, for me, really summarizes what we're trying to do, and that means talking to all of the right people. And just if our Australian colleagues would be happy to take some advice, maybe my one line of advice would be to make sure to engage all of the stakeholders. And I think some of the Australian representatives before were very clear about this. There's a lot of success stories in every single country. Find those success stories, find allies in the corporate sector, in public administration, in civil society, because I am sure they are there. And I think CEREC, the Australian International Renewable Energy Conference, will be a very good opportunity to share those good experiences worldwide, and definitely from Spain, we'll be very, very keen to be able to share those. So thank you very much, Rana. I'm not sure if there's any last takeaways you wanted to share.
Yeah, I guess like one takeaway is the reality also is it's about acceleration. And I also think it is about fully acknowledging that we did not only agree basically in the room, we also had like a diversity of perspectives. And this was really one of the takeaways from my side, because I heard it from many different players, and even in the plenary session, that basically the different participants here have really felt that they were in an environment where we could have those honest discussions. And I think that is something which is very precious and which is really only possible because I think the vision, but also this vast multi-stakeholder community that has participated, and that is a group of very, very passionate people who are working together. I do think that there is indeed the perspectives, and that's something we have heard on several panels, is when we speak about the inclusiveness, so this is for me one of the takeaways, the perspectives differ and the realities differ, and what is at stake also differs. And I think this just energy transition has a component that is local, that is national, and that is also global. And I felt we had lots of parts where it was global solutions require global discussions also, but the implementation is happening locally very clearly. Another takeaway, I think, and we see it in the declaration, so there is a conference declaration, and with regard to this, one of the outcomes was very clearly, where do we, and some of the participants have really asked this, where do we bring this dialogue, basically? All of you are going home, bring the discussions back into your realities and the implementation. So this was really calling for a more continuous dialogue, and I think this is also why in the declaration that will be presented, also distributed, there is very clearly a commitment of this community to build on the political process of, I think, the Spanish EU presidency, COP upcoming, the SDG 7 review, but also SPIREC and IREC as a renewable energy year, in a moment where it is next year the 20th anniversary of the IREC processes. We feel that collectively we need to basically have the drumbeat of renewable energy, and that's something we'll find in the declaration, with specific attention to renewable energy for transportation, renewable energy for development and reshaping the debate here, and renewable energy and energy efficiency that are two pillars of driving the transition. I would just like, just because at the end of the day, and I feel like I would like to very much thank obviously the Spanish government, but IDE for hosting us, but also very much the implementing team, so the IDE team, and also from my side, the Rent and One Secretariat team, for all the work that has gone into this. And from the Rent and One side, a particular thank you also to Laura, Vibu, and Anna from the IREC team, so thanks a lot. And a big, big thank you to this fabulous community that brings basically those discussions into the global space.
So,
thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Para cerrar y clausurar esta Conferencia Internacional de Energías Renovables, tenemos el honor de contar con la presencia de la Ministra de Transportes, Movilidad y Agenda Urbana, Raquel Sánchez.
Hola, muy buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Es un placer, desde luego, poder estar aquí hoy y contribuir al objetivo de esta conferencia internacional de energías renovables, y quiero felicitar desde luego a los organizadores, al IDA y a REN también por estas magníficas jornadas trabajando para intercambiar enfoques, para avanzar en la configuración de un sistema energético compatible con el desarrollo sostenible de nuestras sociedades. Aprender unos de otros es la mejor manera de conseguirlo, sin duda. Acoger estas jornadas es la reafirmación del compromiso de España con la transición ecológica. Tuvimos la oportunidad de demostrarlo anteriormente con la organización en tiempo récord de la Conferencia de las Naciones Unidas sobre el Cambio Climático en 2019 y esta disposición también a cooperar contra la mayor amenaza a la que la humanidad se ha enfrentado, desde luego que sigue intacta. Este compromiso es mucho más que el empeño de un gobierno, es el reflejo de la cada vez mayor conciencia medioambiental de nuestros ciudadanos y ciudadanas, algo de lo que me siento especialmente orgullosa. La de nuestro país no es una preocupación contemplativa por los efectos del cambio climático. Como dijo el presidente en la inauguración de estas jornadas, tenemos una aspiración legítima y esa aspiración es situar a España como referente en la transición hacia un modelo plenamente descarbonizado. Y para ello llevamos años actuando a todos los niveles. En el ámbito local, nuestras ciudades han logrado reducir sus índices de contaminación y la generación de residuos. Muchas de ellas han implementado planes de movilidad urbana sostenible y están aplicando soluciones tecnológicas innovadoras de ahorro energético. Quiero desde aquí reconocer ese esfuerzo porque, desde luego, la energía más limpia es la que no llega a consumirse. A nivel global, hemos acometido importantes reformas para convertirnos en un potencial mundial de energías renovables. Actualmente, España es el quinto país en potencia eólica instalada y es el séptimo en energía solar. La generación de electricidad a partir de fuentes renovables ha superado con creces los 100.000 gigavatios hora, una cantidad suficiente para abastecer a más de la mitad de los hogares de nuestro país. Si en cierto momento la descarbonización se vio ralentizada por la incertidumbre regulatoria en relación a las condiciones de retribución de la energía renovable y a una normativa poco favorable al autoconsumo, el panorama hoy en día es bien distinto. A diferencia del anterior Gobierno, hemos dejado de poner impuestos al sol. Es más, los hemos eliminado. Nos hemos impuesto como gran meta transformar nuestro sistema productivo de aquí a 2050 y transitar hacia una economía sostenible y eficiente en el uso de sus recursos. Somos conscientes de nuestras fortalezas. Disponemos de los recursos imprescindibles como son el sol, el viento, la biomasa o el litio. Y contamos, además, con el conocimiento investigador y con empresas líderes en el sector de las renovables a nivel mundial. En el año 2022, las energías renovables representaron el 42% de la energía generada en nuestro país y somos el tercer exportador mundial de aerogeneradores. El reto es enorme, pero sabemos que las oportunidades que se abren están a la altura del desafío. Si lo hacemos bien, y créanme cuando les digo que no estamos escatimando esfuerzos, generaremos empleo y actividad, además de ahorros significativos en la factura que pagamos por la importación de combustibles fósiles. Tenemos cálculos elocuentes. Una adecuada ejecución de nuestro Plan Integrado de Energía y Clima hasta el 2030 y de la estrategia de descarbonización a largo plazo redundará en un aumento neto de empleo de calidad. El sector de las renovables podría llegar a crear 468.000 empleos durante la próxima década. Este Gobierno aprovecha cada oportunidad que nos brinda la transición ecológica para generar más y mejores empleos. El otro gran beneficio será la reducción de nuestra dependencia energética. La sustitución de combustibles fósiles nos permitirá ahorrar más de 340.000 millones de euros en importaciones en las próximas 3 décadas, lo que equivale al gasto público en educación de 7 años. De hecho, solo la electrificación completa de nuestro parque actual de turismos en 2050 ya generaría un ahorro de casi 18.000 millones de euros en importaciones respecto al volumen total del año 2019. Desde el Ministerio que dirijo estamos participando activamente de este proceso. A falta de su aprobación definitiva en el Parlamento, hemos culminado una ley, la Ley de Movilidad Sostenible, que impulsará la descarbonización, incrementará la eficiencia del sistema y promoverá la intermodalidad y el trasvase hacia los modos de transporte menos contaminantes. En la comunión entre la movilidad, la sostenibilidad y la innovación se apoyará nuestro futuro crecimiento. Para esta nueva orientación están resultando vitales los fondos del Plan de Recuperación, Transformación y Resiliencia, fruto de la solidaridad europea, de los que el Ministerio de Transportes gestiona casi la cuarta parte, es decir, más de 16.000 millones de euros. La transición ecológica, la revolución digital y la reindustrialización son los 3 grandes ejes sobre los que descansa el plan, con la mirada puesta en alcanzar 4 objetivos transversales. Una España más verde, más digital, más cohesionada desde el punto de vista social y territorial y más igualitaria. Aumentar el peso de las renovables en nuestro sistema de generación hasta hacerlas dominantes hará posible que nuestras grandes apuestas resulten ganadoras. Relacionadas con el ministerio que dirijo, la primera es la electrificación del parque automovilístico y la extensión de los puntos de recarga. Contamos con un plan específico para este sector que es angular en nuestra economía porque representa el 11% de la cifra total del negocio de la industria española. Acapara el 15% de todas nuestras exportaciones y tiene un efecto arrastre sobre otras industrias como son la siderurgia y también los bienes de equipo. Estamos subvencionando proyectos de I+D+I, proyectos de innovación en sostenibilidad y eficiencia energética, proyectos de inversión regional y otros relacionados con la formación, con la cadena de valor del vehículo eléctrico. Vamos a ser, por ejemplo, también el primer país que pondrá en marcha la Academia para las Baterías, que formará en los próximos años a unas 150.000 personas en todos los ámbitos relativos a su desarrollo y fabricación. La segunda gran apuesta de este Ministerio es el ferrocarril, el modo de transporte más sostenible y con la potencialidad suficiente para proporcionar una alternativa verde a las necesidades de movilidad global. Dando al ferrocarril el protagonismo que merece, podremos rebajar la dependencia que España tiene del petróleo importado y reducir las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero. Trabajamos intensamente para mejorar las conexiones transfronterizas con Francia y Portugal, los enlaces ferroviarios con puertos y centros logísticos y para completar los corredores europeos en España y el resto de las actuaciones previstas en la red transeuropea. Queremos duplicar la cuota que el tren representa en el transporte de personas y de mercancías y el tercer ámbito de actuación son las ciudades, de cuyos avances ya hice mención anteriormente. Aún así, siguen siendo responsables del 70% de las emisiones de efecto de gases invernaderos. En consecuencia, el combate al cambio climático y a sus efectos ha de darse necesariamente en ellas y para ellas hemos elaborado como estrategia la Agenda Urbana Española. Su transformación pasa por relegar el vehículo privado fomentando el transporte público y por una planificación que haga innecesarios muchos desplazamientos. Queremos conseguir ciudades energéticamente eficientes, algo que exige una intensa rehabilitación también de su parque edificatorio. Y finalmente, el hecho de disponer de abundantes fuentes de energía renovable hará posible también fomentar el uso del hidrógeno verde en sectores difíciles de electrificar, como son la industria y el transporte pesado, y en el caso del transporte marítimo, y gracias a nuestra posición geoestratégica, aspiramos a ser el principal corredor verde del tráfico mundial. España, por lo tanto, está realizando un enorme esfuerzo para acelerar la transición energética. Creemos que las energías renovables contribuirán decisivamente a mitigar los efectos del calentamiento global e impulsarán nuestro desarrollo económico. Foros como esta conferencia internacional representan una oportunidad extraordinaria para compartir avances y reflexiones en este contexto actual en el que la crisis energética puede solapar la emergencia climática a la que nos enfrentamos. El trabajo continuo de los gobiernos y de la sociedad civil se antoja imprescindible. La mejor manera de expresar nuestra confianza en el futuro es hacer nuestra una frase del escritor mexicano Juan Rulfo, que dice así: hay aire y sol, hay nubes, allá arriba un cielo azul. Hay esperanza en suma. Muchísimas gracias y buenas tardes.